I want to invite Diana Carolina Sierra up to speak to us. Diana is a museum educator, historian, and labor activist. Since 2013, she has collaborated with the Museo de la Palabra y la Imagen to develop pedagogical materials and collect the testimonies of activist women. She's a PhD candidate in History and Women's Studies at the University of Michigan, and her doctoral dissertation examines how rank-and-file women in El Salvador and in revolutionary movements in El Salvador shape the daily practices of labor and armed struggle and the meaning of liberation. Lastly, as if that weren't enough, she organizes undocumented Latino migrant workers in Western Massachusetts. So Diana, please come up and give your talk.
I'll stand and try to really project. I'll just imagine that this is a big popular education workshop. So my name is Diana, and I want to paint a picture for you of what it's like to work in the MUPI, the Museo de la Palabra. So one of our roles is, as popular educators, is to go into communities, host workshops, and I'm going to get into that in more depth. But also it's going into communities to collect testimonies. So for example, I went into the home of a woman named Cleotilde Lopez, 86-year-old woman who opens her door and is walking with me with a cane leading me to her back patio. And there she starts to talk to me about how she participated in some of the biggest national strikes in El Salvador that shook the country in the late 60s and early 70s. And as she's telling me this, tears are falling down her face as she recounts the assassination of her nephew, who was murdered in a notorious massacre in 1975. And we continue the interview, and midway through the interview, she says, what time is it? And I tell her the time, and she's like, I have to go to a labor protest. So this 86-year-old woman is still engaged in these struggles. And I want to explain how the pedagogy of the museum is really rooted in the social movement practices of El Salvador. Popular education was a tool that was used to raise conciencia, raise consciousness among the oppressed. It was an educational method that used collective reflection and linked it to collective action. It was within that context that illiterate peasants first learned to read and write, and to give a name to the oppression that was producing hunger and death. And that pedagogy lives on in the museum. I call this a pedagogy of hope, a popular pedagogy, where we're using politicized education, and what I mean by that is a critical view of education. We're using community engagement, we're using participatory learning methods to, in this case, not learn how to read and write, but to address the injustices that continue to shape post-war El Salvador. And we use memories of collective action because it's in these memories that give continuity to our struggles. Activists situate their struggles within history. We use that to analyze, to critique, and I use the word we because I do identify with these social movements. And I think in teaching the memory of collective action, we allow people to reflect on their own capabilities. And it's in these memories that allows us to carve a pathway forward for justice. So I wanted to discuss, to give you very brief examples of how the museum uses a pedagogy of hope to discuss some very difficult topics, some very traumatic topics centered around state violence. And I'll give the two examples that I'll give are about the 1932 insurrection and genocide and the Civil War. So we're all on the same page. What happened in 1932? Anyone? Clase? Anyone want to give a brief synopsis of what happened in 1932?
La Matanza.
La Matanza? Of who? Who was killed? Indigenous peoples?
Communists.
I'm sorry?
Communists.
Communists, yes. So in 1932, as you'll see in the exhibit, there were extremely brutal living conditions. A worker would have to work 35 centuries to make what a landowner made in 1 year. So extreme class inequality. And in the early 1990s, let me go back and explain what happened after that, those inequalities. Labor activists, peasants, indigenous peoples started producing their own understanding of Marxism, essentially, of who benefits from our exploitation. And they give different names to that, and some of them did explicitly identify as Marxists. There was an insurrection in the western part of the country. The state responded brutally, massacring approximately 1% of the population. The exact numbers are unknown. It's estimated between 10,000 or as many as 30,000. Historians would say that it's closer to 10,000, but it was a population of 1.5 million people. And the exhibit, we'll go through it and about how those consequences of that massacre, the long-term consequences of that massacre. So in the 1990s, Santiago and the historian Jeffrey Gould went into the communities interviewing elders, and from those oral histories, we've been able to produce the exhibit, we've been able to produce the documentary, and we've been able to produce pedagogical materials that travel through the 14 departments of the country. And let's see. To give you an example, from 2003 to 2007, we had about 2,200 elementary school kids participating in these film forums. The exhibit that we made, this exhibit is a new exhibit inaugurated in February of 2015. We approximate around 3,500 students who will be engaging with the exhibit. So this exhibit is making an intervention in how the public understands 1932. So we explore the socioeconomic conditions that led up to the revolt. We talk about the exploitation on coffee plantations, and we really challenge an elite narrative that says that peasants were incapable of organizing. There must have been some sort of external communist influence because peasants are too stupid to know what's in their best interests. And the exhibit also really challenges narratives among certain sectors of the left who always who foregrounded urban activists, non-indigenous activists, in coming into rural communities and organizing peasants. And this new historical interpretation was made possible through interviews with survivors of the massacre itself. And I want to talk a little bit about the new direction that the museum has been taking with gender and memory. So what does a gendered perspective allow us to understand about the 1930s? Well, first, it highlights through, if you look at the documents and the testimonies, that sexual violence was key in structuring the coffee economy. Sexual abuse on coffee plantations, the rape of women, sexual harassment in order to obtain a job. And I'll just quote from one of the documents of the Regional Federation of Salvadoran Workers, who stated in 1930, quote, "The young daughters of the workers can only have relations with the workers once the boss or their sons have abandoned them." And they go on to explain how these women are then bearing the children of landowners. And state repression also augmented or heightened existing gender and class inequalities. So the memories of indigenous women point to how the massacre forced indigenous women to survive in silence, how it generated fear toward political organizing and accelerated the decline of the Nahuatl Pipi language. and heightened ethnic discrimination. So in the testimonies, there's always the emphasis of the refajo. It's in a feminine indigenous garb, and they say, I had to give up my refajo for a ruffled skirt. And for many indigenous women, that symbolizes cultural loss. And we also in the exhibit talk about land dispossession. What happened if 10,000 people are massacred? The documents point to that it was mainly men and boys over the age of 12. What happens to all these women? And to be honest, we're still researching this. We're posing questions. But from the interviews that were done, we have glimpses of that. So for example, how one widow lost her partner, and she had to surrender her land title to a landowner in exchange for a bag of yuca in order to survive. So these exhibits are powerful. I think they're pretty, but as a popular educator, they only are the tip of the iceberg. Exhibits can't be a book on a wall. Sometimes I wish I could do that. I need to put all this detail in, but they're just little seeds to generate interest. So what we do with these exhibits is we host participatory workshops, where if you were in my participatory workshop, you would role play as coffee workers. A group of you would be women, a group of you would be children, and a group of you would be men. And I would play the landowner. And through these historical enactments, young people especially can understand the historical constraints. So what choices do people have in this time period? And why do they make particular choices? And we've hosted these workshops in communities where the massacre was felt the hardest. We think it's important to give people the skills to tell their own histories. So what we do is we train young people and they become exhibit guides. We will donate this material to a community museum, and young people themselves will be their exhibit guides. And we think that that allows us to multiply our efforts. And I want to talk a little bit about the history of the Civil War, how we teach the history of the Civil War. And 1932 and the Civil War may seem like two very separate topics, but in fact they have a very bloody thread that connects the two of them. So General Martinez, who was the person responsible for the massacre of these communist peasants, death squads in the 1970s and 1980s would be named in his honor. And people whose grandfathers were murdered in 1932 were having their partners and their children and their women relatives also being murdered by death squads who were named after General Martinez. And we also approach the history of the Civil War, as Santiago discussed, through the experiences, the lived experiences of combatants, of peasant organizers, of teachers, of students. And we think that their stories offer new interpretations of how we understand this history. So in our programs, again, we try to be very conscientious about the context that we're operating in. We're responding to particular narratives. So we do address, why were people radicalized? What happened that where peasant communities decided to take up arms? That's a logistical nightmare. Organizing is a logistical nightmare, let alone the decision to organize an insurrection, an insurgency. So we take people through the process. How did people come to those decisions? Why did the state, why did paramilitaries, landowners, repress civilian movements? Who was benefiting from that? And how did social movement participants, including FML and combatants, what was their political vision? And these interventions, these questions are still relevant. Right-wing narratives in El Salvador constantly absolve the responsibility of the state in committing human rights abuses. Just I think, what was it, 2 years ago, that one of the most commonly transited streets in San Salvador was named after the death squad leader who murdered Monsignor Romero and who founded the contemporary right-wing party. These things are still very much in the public consciousness. You can literally go to the countryside, and this happened to me. I was on a log and I was kicking my feet in the dirt, and I found bullet cartridges in the dirt. So these narratives continue to impact people's lives, and they impact how young people understand their history. So for example, public school teachers in 2013 reported how their students, quote, struggled to understand the causes that gave rise to the Civil War and to understand key turning points. And there are reasons why they're confused. There is still an ongoing campaign in El Salvador and in Central America to create confusion about why did people participate in social movements, what was the role of the state. And so that's why we make those particular interventions. And the museum has its own educational programs, but we're really trying to support grassroots memory initiatives itself. We're trying to replicate our efforts. And one of the ways that we've done that is by working with small committees of former peasant organizers and combatants. So we worked with a committee in Chalatenango, a group of women, and we've been helping them plan their museum. Their very humble museum that has water leaking in and bats coming into it. And we've done workshops with these mujeres organizadas, and they really push us to reconsider how the history of the war is written. So for example, the dominant narrative in the historiography, what historians tell about the past, is that the Central American revolutions were a failure for women, that sexism triumphed and socialist revolutions ultimately failed women. But if you look at the archives, if you talk to the women who were participants themselves, they paint a very radically different picture. So for example, in the workshops that we led, we did a drawing. We did a drawing of what life was like before for La Mujer Organizada. And they called this drawing La Campesina Submisa, the submissive peasant woman. And then I asked them, what was life after you started becoming politically active? And they called that drawing La Mujer Organizada. And in these drawings and in these debates that were generated amongst themselves, they talked about how popular organization expanded the collective decision-making power of women, transformed how women saw themselves, and led them to understand the specific grievances of peasant women. In their oral histories, they talk about how the efforts to get the men to make tortillas, because they didn't want to make tortillas, and so there are all these struggles around that. They talked about the struggles to gain access to sanitary napkins in the guerrilla territories, and the struggles to enact punishments against abusers of women. So in these oral histories, it's a very different picture of how we understand the history of the Civil War. And I think their vision, their memory of collective action and what is possible with collective action is more relevant than ever. This may be in part shaped by I live in the United States, and I see how there's a very narrow definition of feminism. That feminism is the right of corporate, wealthy, especially white women, to participate in the spoils of empire. And the visions of these women point to a very different understanding of what it means for women to have dignity. And it's through these memories that these women are trying to encourage younger generations to be mindful and critical of the places in which they live. And it's through these insurgent memories that they're trying to carve a pathway forward for present-day struggles, the present-day struggles that you and I will lead. So I'll end it there. And I can touch on lots of different things, but I thought maybe we could see what you guys are interested in, and we'll take it from there. Thanks.